Hello and welcome to the WPAOG podcast. This episode features a discussion between LTC Tom Dull, Executive Officer at the Character Integration Advisory Group at West Point, and Major Ben Elliott, Major Marc Meybaum, and Captain Brian Martinez. They are three officers who have conducted research on the Army profession and are instructors of MX400 Officership, a course for first-class cadets at West Point that includes lessons on the oath of office. In this episode, they provide a deep understanding of the oath of commissioned officers by discussing its origin and history, relive stories of their own commissioning ceremonies, and discuss the importance of teaching the value of trust and honor to first-class cadets at West Point. Now, please enjoy this discussion between Lieutenant Colonel Tom Dull, Major Promotable Ben Elliott, Major Marc Meybaum, and Captain Brian Martinez.
All right, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Tom Dull, and I'm joined today by three officers who have conducted research on the Army profession and teach a class on the oath of office to first-class cadets at West Point. Major Promotable Ben Elliott, good to have you with us today, Ben.
You too, sir. It's great to be here.
Major Marc Meybaum, thanks for being here too, Marc.
Yeah, hello, everybody.
And then Captain Promotable Brian Martinez, good to have you on here too, Brian.
Pleasure to be here, sir.
Well, gentlemen, this is a really interesting topic, and you think about this oath of office. It's unique, and frankly, it's pretty special. I was wondering, up front, if each of you could kind of describe your initial oath, that commissioning ceremony, and perhaps what stood out to you, knowing that it's somewhat personal and somewhat reflective. Ben, how did that look for you back in 2007?
Yeah, sure thing, sir. Yeah, I remember in some ways, and maybe this isn't really the approved solution, but I remember a few things about it. One was that we signed our DA-71s in a classroom up in Washington Hall, and we forward dated it to May 27th, which was our graduation day. So you got to do all that administrative paperwork up front. I've actually vividly remember being in the room signing that, not even really reading it or knowing what it meant. Then graduation day came around, and what my personal story was like is after we sweared our oath in front of the viewing public and those up in Mikey Stadium, we had the opportunity, a number of us, to go down to the cadet chapel where we participated in a spiritual commissioning ceremony. And following that, I had asked my sponsor, who was here with me for 4 years at West Point, and had spent time at his house with his family on a number of different occasions. And he, served as a mentor of sorts. And so it was him serving as the officiating officer, Major Darren Thompson at the time, as well as Kelly, his wife. And then my family was there. So both my sisters, my fiance as well, who I was engaged to be married to about 30 days later. And so many of those people were there, as well as some lifelong friends that have grown up with us on the farm in central Nebraska. What I remember about that occasion is I remember the moments raising my right hand and swearing the oath with Darren Thompson. I only remember afterwards, it was a teary-eyed occasion where I was thanking those people that had brought me through my time at West Point and really for their support. I have a picture and do remember Major Thompson administering the oath to me and the significance that I felt of it overlooking the cadet area here at West Point on the back steps of the cadet chapel. And so certainly it was a moving occasion, but I think as we get into this podcast a little bit more, you'll find that my understanding of the oath has changed over time. And I certainly didn't know exactly what it meant when I took it back then in 2007.
Yeah, so I was going to say, Ben, so in 2007, there was probably not a formal education or a formal class that you had taken on kind of the commission, right? What the commission is for the officer, and then also that covenant with that oath. Is that a fair assumption?
We had our military science courses, 100, 200, 300, 400 here at West Point. And so we talked about the nature of being a professional officer in some ways, shapes, and forms. But I am certain that we didn't spend time lingering on the oath to the nature that we have been, at least in the past few years that I've been here at West Point working through that project.
No, that's interesting. No, I appreciate that. It's as you kind of spoke it talked about your commissioning service, and when you gave your oath, it kind of dawned on me the weight. You said maybe there were some emotions there, but there's some weight. And we'll take a look at this later on, but the weight of what it means to say those words. So no, I appreciate you sharing that. That's interesting. Hey, Mark, a couple of years down the road from Ben, you're here at West Point, and then you have a ceremony or service as well. How did that look for you back in 2012?
Oh, yes, sir. So May 26th, 2012, I remember up in the stadium for the graduation ceremony. It was a very sunny day. I don't remember a single word there because we were so focused on that hat toss, right? And it was sweltering heat. Much more intimate, coming down to Trophy Point and having our own commissioning ceremonies with our selected officers. In my case, it was my TAC officer. He was a mentor to me then. He's a mentor to me now. So I had him there in a large portion of my family right there on Trophy Point. But I remember thinking, as we were kind of prepping to do this conversation here, I remember thinking that, gosh, it's a good thing that he memorized the oath because in the moment I was very much following along. And from things along the way, whether it's speeches, you take oaths previously, right there at our day, you do a form of the oath, right? You do an oath at affirmation, right? To kind of swear to support this Constitution. But you take that full commissioning oath there on graduation. And so I had an idea of what it meant, but it was very emotional. It was emotional based, maybe not based in any kind of reflection we had done deliberately on the words of that oath. But you do feel the sense of elation that, hey, you made it here through this commissioning program. You also just feel a sense of pride. There is a degree of unknown because you're like, all right, here it is. Like, what is this supposed to feel like with these bars on now? But those are kind of my reflections as I look back on that day. Obviously, we'll get into what that oath and what the meaning has translated to now a little further down.
No, it's interesting. You talked about it. You think about, you had family and friends there with you on that day. And there's something that is unique about that too, right? And kind of that public kind of commitment and those words that you're showing and that you're kind of giving resolve to. So, in this resolution that goes along with this, so pretty unique. Appreciate that. Brian, still in 2012, kind of middle America at this point in time in Chicago at University of Loyola. How did it look for you coming out of the Reserve Officer Training Corps, ROTC? How was that commissioning service with oath for you on that day?
Yes, sir. So for us in ROTC, we have a lot of satellite schools. So different schools make up a battalion. And so even us being the sixth largest ROTC battalion, we still only had 32 being commissioned on that day. That was the size of our graduating class. So we all just, we're in Chicago. We might as well celebrate Chicago. So we were in downtown Chicago and we went to the Union League Club of Chicago, which they're spread all around the country and they really date back to the American Civil War. So there's a lot of history tied there. It was specifically chosen for that. And really it was, when we get there, everyone who's about to recite the oath and commission, it's really us and our families. And we're really just talking amongst each other, what this means to us. We're in a separate room. And then once the actual event begins, we're all brought in. We're all audience members for each other. So we all sit with our families, and one by one, we were all brought up on stage individually. You and your family are the only ones on stage. And the officer who is reciting the oath, for me, it was Lieutenant Colonel Tom Dull and Master Sergeant Pena, are two of our instructors. They were there on stage, and after reciting the oath, the biggest thing that I remember is the first salute. So my sister, who was currently an NCO in the Air Force, she was on there, and really, I just remember this tunnel vision of just me and her on stage, taking a salute from a family member, from someone you love. And I'd like to say that I was thinking about the future and what this all means, but really I was in the moment and I was happy at that time. And we did not go into depth on the oath and its significance. I've learned a lot, and looking back, I wish we had, but I think that time alone, getting that first salute right there in front of family, in front of peers, was probably the most impactful thing for my ceremony.
That's interesting. I think, hearing all three of your stories of your commissioning service and the oath that you gave, you can see, one, there's ritual to it, right? And there's probably good reason to that. There's order to it. There's good reason to that. There's deliberation and how it was going to look and how it was going to play out in those few minutes that commission service took place. What is interesting, I think, is that all three of you kind of had limited understanding of perhaps, through legal and through the legality and the history of what this oath is, what this commissioning service is, right? Kind of what that means for you as officers. And so that's pretty interesting. When you think of that, right? And you think where you were at, and as all three of you are now instructors here at West Point in MX400 officership, right? The SUPS capstone course here at the Academy. How do you all look to teach and communicate to those first class cadets, really the relationship of the commission and the oath?
As you mentioned, we teach a course called MX400, really the superintendent's capstone course. Something that didn't exist when I was a cadet back here, graduated in 2007. But as it's evolved, it's given cadets a real great opportunity to think about what it means to be an expert in the practice of commissioned military service, defining our roles underneath our Army ethic. Both include, military expertise, a servant to the nation, a trusted Army professional. In there, we have an opportunity as we progress through understanding the nature of the profession, an opportunity to look at what the commission and what the oath really means. And so both Mark and Brian are fellow instructors with me here in the course, and have different approaches, have different kind of meaning and thoughtfulness to what it means to us. I appreciate their thoughts on it. Mark, I know you're dying to talk about a few things with it.
No, absolutely. We all, I think, enjoy this lesson, right? It might be because we learned it for the first time coming to, maybe in this level of depth, for the first time coming back to be instructors in this course. But, first thing that we kind of start out with the cadets is the whole procedure of it. It's not some inane ritual, right? There's meaning behind every step in this process, including being granted the commission, right? And so usually take a look at with the cadets, okay, what is in that? And I remember discovering this when we were doing the faculty development to be an instructor here. Like, oh my word, I don't think I've read mine in quite some time, right? And, each word has meaning. When we talk about the president, reposing special trust and confidence in these qualities, right, of patriotism, valor, fidelity, and abilities. So that's usually where we start. And then we talk about the procedure of that. Okay, this is granted to you. It's in some ways offered to you by the president, to make you an agent of the executive branch of government. And then your part of that handshake, so to speak, is your oath, right?
I mean, that's interesting. You talk about it's granted to the officer, right, through the commission. I mean, what exactly is being granted to the officer? I mean, what does that mean?
I mean, it follows from an appointment, right? That the president has appointed us based on our character, competence, and commitment. And then that appointment comes before the granting of the commission, which, as Mark said, has all the attributes of our valor, fidelity, personal abilities that allow the officer to exercise the office.
Yeah. And I think going back to the commissioning script, right, what Mark was talking about is don't overlook that. It's special trust and confidence. What is that trust? What is that confidence that the president, on behalf of the American people, have put into you to be an officer? And then we can go into the patriotism, valor, fidelity, ability. And that's how I approach breaking all of that down in the classroom. What abilities have you demonstrated?
I mean, are we talking kind of like is it certification, Brian? I mean, is it certification and therefore how we've seen the future officer come through that commissioning source, whether, West Point, ROTC, Officer Candidate School? Is that kind of what we're seeing with that commission?
I think so. Yes, it's a certification that's continual. But have you demonstrated patriotism? Have you shown, maybe not that you've displayed valor under fire right now, but are you willing to? fidelity. Are you loyal to country, duty, respect, and then abilities? And I always ask students, like, what abilities have you demonstrated that make this granting of a commission? How have you earned this granting of a commission?
Right. I think, as we read, the cadets obviously read some professional literature in the lead up to that class, and it kind of describes in greater detail those qualities and the importance of fidelity, right? And that faithfulness to the cause that is to support and defend the Constitution, and that being a wholly volitional aspect, right? Like that is something wholly within your control, is being faithful to that cause. And we usually have a point of reflection right there, right? And discuss the deep meaning of that part, right? The faithfulness, the fidelity. So
I think like as you hear the commission, right? The commissioning kind of script that is part of that. I mean, something that to a degree jumps out is this idea of obedience, right? I mean, it is the president has reposed this special trust. There's somewhat of an understanding that the officer, right, looks at this commission and has to determine whether he or she is going to be obedient to that. And that, there's a lot, I think, that goes into that and what that means for the officer.
To the point of obedience, when you read the words of the commission certificate, it says that the commission requires and charges officers to render our obedience to the president and to the other officers outranking us or over us. But it also continues in force, and it continues through the distinct pleasure of the office on which we hold. And so in many ways, it's like a foundational, document for us to understand before we can really understand the oath that we're swearing our life and our defense towards the Constitution. And so I think it's key that, not only do we look at the oath with a critical lens, but we also look at the commission with a critical lens.
We have the commission, right, that officers are given or granted from the president of the United States. And then there's this special kind of covenant that takes place after that with the oath of office. How do y'all work with the cadets to understand that relationship?
I'll jump in there just because I love this particular portion of this conversation. So before looking into the words of the oath, and that is vitally important to understand what you're swearing to, it's just the whole act of swearing an oath, right? And especially in modern day when that might be less common, I guess there's arguments both ways on that, but this is one of the few professions where you'll raise your right hand and you'll give your honest word in a public setting. And it's your first act as an officer, right? Your first act of your word meaning something legally binding in a way. As officers, you can give verbal orders, but your first act of honest, officership is given that oath. And so there's a lot of symbolism there. And we kind of unpack that because it's important to understand, even in addition to the words of the oath and their meaning.
You think about the power of those words. And the question I have recently asked over is we've done some work on what this oath means, right? I think something happens at the oath, right? Something happens when the officer, raises their right hand and recites those words, right? And I think two things kind of come out, right? It's this establishment of trust, right? Knowing that you've been granted the commission. Now you're giving your word. It's establishment of trust, which I think is trust with the American people, the American public, and the American government. And then it's this idea of commitment, which I think is seen in the concept of unlimited liability. I mean, am I off base on there? What do you see? If you look at commitment, you look at trust.
I do think there is a semblance of trust, and we can get into some more of the dynamics on the oath being taken in public versus private. But I do think that trust is a big aspect of that oath process. Trust between what you are agreeing to do, what you are willing to accept, the risks you are willing to take. It's not mentioned in the oath, but it's implied, right? And that's getting back to that aspect of unlimited liability that you brought up, sir, is it's implied that there are risks to what you're agreeing to accept upon accepting that commission.
How you said it's, some things happen or a change occurs there while you're doing the repetition, while you're physically changing the posture of your body towards, your hand raised when this is an unusual thing to do in terms of your daily lifestyle. Like, we often don't raise our right hands towards things, but in just the nature of that posture change, you're also formalizing your moral obligation that is required of officers. And as Mark earlier said, you're acting now as agents of society, or agents of the American people, agents of the executive branch. Not only that change, but then the nature of now having an accountability towards the American people to the point of trust. The trust is a vital part of that. But as you do it in public and in front of people that you care about, it becomes part of our accountability message towards the American people. And it also strengthens kind of that affection, the American people, and the support that they have towards the military in exchange.
Brian, you bring up a great point in kind of pointing out that there's not a defined list, either in the commission or the oath itself, of duties that you're swearing to. It's not a rote point-by-point list. And in fact, it just says that, right? Discharge the duties of the office. I actually love the line that follows that, or the words that follow that in the commission. And it says, performing all manner of things thereunto belonging. Like, if you ever needed a
duty description for an officer.
Yeah, a duty description. All manner of things, right? When you think about what that might mean, it's just getting to unpack that weight with the cadets and that breadth of possibilities that are out there associated with serving as an officer. It's powerful. And you frequently, I'd love to hear some stories from you all, but like, the cadets come up to you, they're like, wow, geez, sir, I didn't know that, right? I wasn't maybe previously aware, and it's powerful. They're neither scared nor, but I think they're more motivated by it. But it is a powerful lesson,
which is the goodness of the lesson itself, right? So they can see that, right? As future officers, they can see that. You think about that, right? All those things that as officers you have experienced, right? You have done, and you may not think that you are, maybe certified in a certain kind of area to do things, maybe budgeting or technology, and you think, hey, I'm just, I'm an armor officer, or I'm an intelligence officer, or I'm an infantry officer, right? And this is kind of my bread and butter, but there's a lot that goes into it. We want our officers, right? Even us, right? We want, as officers, and we want our officers to be trustworthy. And that's why, I kind of go back to that. You kind of think of everything that goes with that. And that phrase in there says, I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office upon which I'm about to do, right? And so you can see this establishment of trust. I'm giving my word to the American people. I'm giving my word to the American government that I will well and faithfully, that I will be trusted and categorically trustworthy. And so I will do that in everything I do. And therefore it's unique, right, to what the Academy has. They want officers that, live honorably, lead honorably, demonstrate excellence, right? They're trustworthy, right? That equates, I think, to trustworthiness, right? And that's, Tom Dull's interpretation of it. But it's an interesting kind of look at it. And so kind of that first, like, hey, what happens at the oath? Well, you establish trust, right? We establish trust as officers, right? And I think that second portion, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, is this idea, like, you establish commitment, right? And there's something unique, right, that we know, and I know you all teach us as well in MX400, but with that commitment comes this concept of unlimited liability, which I think goes back on the oath. I mean, what do you think about that as far as commitment with respect to unlimited liability?
Unlimited liability, first introduced by Sir John Hackett in 1962, and then mentioned in the Profession of Arms in 1963. It's not an actual contract, right? It's implied. It's a moral mental model, moral framework. I think Nikki Coleman does describe it really well when she says that members of the military have the potential to be exposed to two of the greatest risks you can be. One is using lethal force to take life, and two is the potential risk of loss of life, yours or that of your soldiers. And that unlimited liability is you have the potential to face both those risks in an unlimited number of ways. And knowing that, you accept that, you know that's a possibility, and you still are willing to recite the oath and take on that responsibility. I think it shows, going back to your original point, sir, of trust, it shows great commitment there that I'm willing to do this. I'm willing to accept these risks.
Yeah, and I think to the point of that, like I don't think thinking back to where I started, didn't really reflect on that or think, yeah, as I raise my hand, this is what I'm also swearing to support and defend. And, considered my own mortality, considered the reality of the profession, but never really dawned on me that nature of unlimited liability or how you said it there, that I could be faced with an unlimited number of possibilities on which I might, be forced to take life or be forced with my own perils to consider. So I think that introduction, at least in terms of the course and what we talk about, has been eye-opening, not only to me in retrospect, but also to cadets as they understand this better for themselves.
That is so true, right? And then the other part that I think makes it so powerful from a trust aspect is harping on the unqualified nature of it. How can you help but trust someone who's willing to swear the oath honestly, right? And have no qualifiers, right? I will support and defend that Constitution, right? And execute these duties, right, that are undefined, right, to an unlimited extent, no caveats. And I think that is an integral part of the bedrock of trust that we have with the American people is when they see a service member, I think they believe that, right? That most people believe that we will be faithful to that cause.
I mean, I think that's interesting, right? Because you kind of consider, I had written down some notes here, and I was thinking like, this trust and this commitment, right? So trust that you build with, I think, the American people and the American government, and then this commitment, which, I'm teasing out a little bit, unlimited liability, but like, I mean, it's an officer who is to be reliable, who's to be moral, who's to be honorable, right? Who's to be excellent, right? And those are high standards, right? But maybe it's the pursuit of that, right? As you give your word to do that.
Yeah, the aspirational nature of it is that's where we strive to be. And so, yeah, I mean, it comes with it a number of things that involves a desire, a yearning, a pinnacle type moment in who we can become. And I think that going through the process of realizing what our developmental needs are and our strengths as we go through it are paramount. Lingering on and maybe converting to where we have them and cadets look through this oath at the words. Well, the one that sticks out to me is this idea of mental reservations, because really doing all of this unlimited liability and being comfortable with that, but without any mental reservations, that can become one that, takes deeper examination. That is there really nothing that I'm reserved about? Is there really nothing that gives me pause about this great profession? And so, I think that can draw out a lot of great conversation and thoughts from where they're at this time.
Now you're just queuing me back up about other things we see in class, right? Like that. I know I'm cutting Colonel Dulles off. He's got probably some good questions for us, but you think about even asking that question, what do you remember from constitutional law? And, we have them reread the Constitution in preparation for that lesson. Like, are you sure, right? This is what you're swearing to support and defend. Are you at the very least familiar with it? But more than likely, do you have a good understanding of what you are swearing to support and defend? And that always is a fruitful conversation with cadets.
So your prep going into the class, you do the oath class for MX400. What are cadets looking at? What are they reading? And there's an assignment, I think, too. How does that look for them? How do they prepare for this conversation in class?
So the required reading does focus heavily on the armed forces officer. We do draw a lot from that text that does give a pretty good argument on both the commission and the oath. We do have them. There is an assignment, sir, that you're referencing where we have them rewrite the oath of commission. And sometimes cadets get a little off put with that, but in their own words. We want them to internalize what the oath means to them, reflect on what each specific word, what really stands out to you. And so we have them rewrite it, explain to us why they chose those words, why they chose those stanzas, why they chose to omit something, why they chose to add something. And then the assignment ends with them describing the significance of the oath, why we take it publicly, and then we want them to tell us, what's your plan? Where are you going to do it? Who do you want to administer the oath to you? Who do you want present? Why? Why is that so important to you? We want to put them in that reflection mode so that way they can start thinking about it and really start internalizing what's it going to mean on that day in May when they raise that right hand and accept it.
That's pretty interesting because, up front, listen to y'all tell your stories of your commissioning ceremony, right? Ben 15 years ago, Brian and Mark 10 years ago, you didn't have that, right? And you didn't think about that. But now, fast forward, we're having these future officers take a look at this, right? To see what it sounds like, some of the constitutional law that ties them legally to it, right? And then kind of the reason why we do this, and then their responsibility that comes out of that. So that's pretty interesting, pretty powerful on that. I was thinking, as we're going along in that, and you were talking, Brian, a little bit about, some of the things you look at in MX400 on the oath. Like, is there conversation? Is there discussion? And maybe, just general knowledge for this episode. We think about the history of the oath, right? The oath of office. I mean, how was that generated, over 200 years ago, 240 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, oaths themselves have been around for, millennia. When you look back at some of the ways that the Roman Republic required oath loyalty, and really, some of that framed the way that Western thought existed early on. But, at the outbreak of the American Revolution, many of the American ideals, and specifically the way that we modeled the nucleus of the Army and the Navy, came from the British system, which was based on kind of this loyalty oaths and this established structure. What I love about it is when the first oath that ever existed inside of our country in June 1775 was at the same time that the American Continental Army was established. And so both for officer and enlisted, we had an oath that was about, really it was more of a contractual one. It was binding for a year of service in the Continental Army. And so it bound the government to the Army. But later, as that evolved and kind of continuing this thought of the British continental system, we had 13 frigates that we needed run, and they needed to be run by commissioned officers, as well as leaders and warrant officers. And then, as that evolved and then continued to evolve, the thing that once, following where it was written into the Articles of War and after the development of the Constitution, or just prior to it, actually, in June 1789, the first act of the first bill within the first session of the first Congress, Statute 1, Chapter 1, was an act to establish regulate and time the manner of administering certain oaths. That's what it was called. And so that established the oath that was required by civil and military service towards our country. Once the Constitution was formed and we see where the oath requirements exist within our legally binding document of the Constitution, you see that swear and affirm officially come into the vernacular of our oaths. And so what I love about teaching that and teaching the history of it is that you see that here, even on this ground, this sacred ground of West Point, where even before the Constitution was established, there was an idea of people that were holding firm to an idea of a country that was still under development. It was still yet to be established.
That's powerful, Ben. You think about, having done some of this work on the oath, right? I think they were interested in hey, we don't want you to kind of tie to England, right? But we want you to kind of be loyal to this future idea of America.
There was a great fear of that too, that there would be loyalists towards the crown continuing. And so I think that's why our founding fathers, as well as our fathers of the Continental Army, decided, hey, we need to ensure loyalty towards this cause and towards the Republic and towards the servants of this country.
In point of fact, that there were issues, right? There were those here at the time, America, that were still loyal to England, right? And so people were trying to figure things out. But you go back to that idea of trust, right? Establishing trust, and you go back to the idea of establishing commitment, right? And you do that through your personal word, your oath, right? Whether oath of office, the enlisted oath, right? That's pretty unique. What we know in the verbiage of the oath, that wasn't in 1789. That was not the same verbiage, right? It was different. The verbiage we have now, when did that come to fruition?
There's an evolution, kind of an ebb and flow of the way that our republic existed over time. And certainly as it passed through where we came through our Civil War in the 1860s is, often quoted the ironclad oath for loyalty towards the Union. It really, in its form and the nature in which we take it, existed at the time of 1884 is when the final kind of touches were put on it. And so when you think of us taking the oath today, the same oath I took in 2007, the same oath that, these firsties will take here in a few months, it's the same oath as MacArthur. It's the same oath as Pershing. It's the same oath as Schwarzkopf. It's the same oath that has existed over the course of hundreds of years that draws our legacy of who we are as officers towards those that have gone before us.
Regardless of branch as well. Every officer, not just Army, not just West, every officer, right, to show that trust and commitment, but also that shared understanding of this is the oath that every officer takes.
Well, I think that's kind of unique, right? You kind of consider, even in our Army's doctrine, ADP 622, and it talks about this profession, right? And how this kind of ties into it with the officer. And that profession, right? And I would say that, I agree with Brian, that profession has gone on for, 2 centuries. It's just really unique, right? And so it's shared, right? It's shared and therefore stewarded, right, along the way and through our great country's history. Mark, do you have something on that?
I think that the unwavering kind of nature of that, generally since 1884, right? I think they added maybe like having been appointed an officer in a particular branch in the 50s. But, other than that, the whole context of swearing to the Constitution is immovable, right? I know, with the recent changeover in monarch in England, right? They swear to a particular monarch, right? But for Americans, it's been unchanging for the American officer, and it serves as that rallying point, right? No matter the branch of service, the context, the grade you're in at the time when you swear or reaffirm at a promotion, it is that rallying point, is the Constitution, right? And the what is enshrined therein. So,
yeah, one of the things, as you talked about, I'm going to return, Mark, to your point too, but one of the things that I was thinking about as you brought up the nature of our communities of practice, both with the civilian and the military armed member, one of my most fondest memories of taking the oath, or retaking the oath, in fact, was getting the opportunity to do it at the Director of National Intelligence's office with members of ODNI, whoever wanted to, really, at that day. It was on Constitution Day, and DNI Coates led us in the reciting of our oath. And for me, as a military member working in a civilian agency, it really brought home the point that this isn't just military members. This isn't just me. This isn't just people like me that are doing this. This is servants of our country, whether you're wearing the cloth of military service or swearing to defend it in the ways in which you do as in any other capacity. In terms of that being the rallying point, to me, that was something that, as I reflected on this, that I wanted to make sure was noted, as you all said. But it really, like, going back to the point of what our rallying cry is, or what we can center our idea on, right? This Constitution has been unwavering for over 200 years. It really is the document that is guiding our nation, right? And it's guiding who we are as the being of a nation. And so being able to swear on that, it becomes a sacred obligation.
Yeah, never perfect, right? And sometimes things go difficult, but this idea, right? This ideal idea of America into this idea of Constitution. Yeah, it is interesting. So we have 240 years, 245 years of history. This commission is granted. It's accounted for, embedded in, the Constitution, Article 2, right? And then we have this oath. You think about history, right? How then is the oath relevant today? How do our future officers kind of consider it, talk about it? And I think even more, like, you all are, kind of career officers. You've been serving for 10, 15 years. How has it remained relevant in your lives, and how do you kind of convey that to our future officers in the classroom?
For initial thought, I'll harken back to some we already discussed a little bit, but the act of giving your word, I think, is very important to me, and I harp on it in class, because you're not going to hand out contracts as an officer. Oftentimes, you're going to give verbal orders, and those orders, might be under extreme duress, and they'll be obeyed because of the professionalism and the high degree of readiness of our Army, right, and the professionalism of our soldiers and NCOs. The orders that lieutenant is about to give, whether it's in combat or otherwise, will be followed. And so I think the act of taking an oath, right, and understanding the importance that your words mean something that is binding. It's not quibbling. You can't just weasel out of it in our profession, and nor do we expect that of West Pointers or anyone else who's commissioning from other commissioning sources, right? That's the importance of your word and your integrity. And so we kind of dwell there. And then, yes, it is returned into you can get lost in a lot of different things about the current operating environment and all kinds of things to consider, but the end cause is that Constitution and supporting and defending. But that's kind of my take on it, or where I tend to lean.
I think that's also tied into why we continue to take the oath throughout our career, right? You take it when you promote first lieutenant, captain. I'll retake mine next month when I promote. And a lot to what Mark referenced, understand the significance of it, but your authority, scope of authority and duties changes with rank. But I think it's important to always reach back and understand the significance of the oath, what you're swearing to support and defend, the ideals of the Constitution, which is human life, freedom, human dignity, and always be aware of that. And regardless whether you're in 5 years, 25 years, I think you always need to reach back to that and reestablish that commitment, as you mentioned earlier, sir.
One thing I've looked at, and I appreciate that, Brian, one thing I've looked at as I've studied the oath independently too, is that I think this oath, right, creates in our Army, in our profession, and in all the military branches, really cohesion. I think it has this opportunity. I think it kind of, on whatever day it is reception day, if it's, showing up to basic training, the soldier, the airman, the sailor, they recite this oath. They are now included in the profession of arms. And this is opportunity to immediately, they've given their bond, right? And so now you can start with this cohesion, this idea of building a team of men and women who have individually committed to be a part of something, right? You can see this drawn out, right? You think about, even as, I have children and teenagers, and they're kind of concerned. They're looking for how, these organizations, and they want to be involved and they want to be included. And I don't know if there's a better way than in an oath within our Army. It says, hey, come on in. We know that you are committed. You've given your word just like the rest of us. Now we can now serve. We can well and faithfully uphold these duties, right? We can support and defend, right? And we can do this together. And I think there's just kind of a uniqueness that comes out of the oath as we individually do it, but collectively have that same bond. I was thinking about something that now, again, I said it a couple times, but 15 years ago, Ben, you had your ceremony. 10 years ago, Mark and Brian, right? You now talk, you teach. I'm assuming you have the opportunities to preside over now commissioning ceremonies. I'd be interested in how all three of you approach those with the knowledge you now have about this great commissioning that's granted to us and this oath that we do. How does that look?
a lot of the similar things that we've talked about, but I think one thing that's unique, especially in the presence of family and in public, is acknowledging the sacrifice, right? The unknown sacrifice that that officer is committing to. It's certainly a great accomplishment in that day, but the kind of willingness to put yourself out there into the unknown in support of the Constitution is kind of where I frame my comments, and acknowledging the support that takes from the people that are present. Cadets often have family, friends, mentors of all stripes there to kind of support them on that day. And it's a great way to acknowledge their support, right, of this young officer taking the oath, because it is a sacrifice. You're giving up certain freedoms that you would otherwise have, whether that's choosing where you're going to live or, just receiving orders to move out, put yourself in harm's way, right? And Army families feel that, right? And they know that and they are proud of it. And I think it's important to acknowledge that sacrifice as well, because I think although it's the officer's responsibility, and giving a nod to the family and their support is definitely something we hadn't talked about yet, but I like to acknowledge.
I do a similar thing where, yes, I'm there to preside over a ceremony, but I address the family directly. And it's really, this is a big deal. And what they're willing to do, all the work they've done to get to this point, the decisions they've made, the actions they've taken, it's a big deal. So I always go back to the commissioning script and I discuss the abilities that they've demonstrated and how they're willing to be courageous in the face of danger. And I really just want the family to walk out of there with the idea that what they just joined, the profession they just joined, is they're going to fight for the greater good. They're going to support and defend the Constitution, and what they're doing is going to make a difference. And that's why I too, Mark, address it to the family.
Similarly, Brian, you just mentioned the support of the Constitution. And so having done a few of these, what I always bring with me to give to them is one of the small pocket guide copies of the Constitution. And I talk about it in front of the family and talk about what it means to support and defend this document, this idea. And many times, that takes the place of the sacred ground that we've walked here at West Point and have defended this ground. But before they even raise their right hand and we administer the oath, I tell them, I actually have them unbutton their coat and put this in their breast pocket. And I say, this, before you raise your right hand, this needs to be close to your heart, because this is going to be the thing that you love and you cherish. And you're telling me, your family, and your country that you're willing to die for this document. You're willing to die for the idea. One of the things that recalls back into me is, I may even get a little academic on them and provide them, a quote from Alexander Hamilton's Federalist Papers and say that, what we're getting is responsibility, and our responsibility empowers us to make judgment-based decisions. And that's what we are doing now. And that's what we are charged with as officers in the Army. Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 25 said, "The sacred reverence which ought to be maintained in the breast of rulers towards the Constitution of a country is what drives us and gives us our importance." And so as that sits next to their breast and their heart before they take that oath, I implore them to, hold that sacred and hold that bare to everything they do. It also, in a way, connects them not only to the history of the Constitution, but back to everything that involves the history of those that have taken this oath in service to this country.
And that's right. I mean, you think about this. I love the way you say it, Ben, with this kind of solemn ground here at West Point. But this ground has been part of our country's history since the inception of our country's history, right? And it was key terrain. And then being able to know that through our Constitution, legally, right, and our history, right, we all share this oath. And I think, again, pushing it forward, and you have these opportunities with these families to explain that. And frankly, to let them know that they have a portion of it too, right? And they've helped develop, right? And then, Brian, exactly what you're saying is we, as officers, reaffirm our oath, whether in our promotion ceremonies or along the way, we continue to build and establish trust with our American people, with our American government, and to support and defend our country.
And I think it's important, it may just appear ceremonial, to even just say that this isn't window dressing and this isn't just pageantry. This is not ceremonial for the purpose of being ceremonial or making us feel good about ourselves. This is an oath, a solemn obligation that we're taking here on this day, and that lasts, like the commission says, in perpetuity or for however long that it continues in force at the pleasure of the country.
You all have done just as many as I have while I've been here. And I think that's a unique thing about being here, right, at West Point, is getting to preside over multiple commissioning, not just promotions, but I think everyone would agree that the profession is in good hands. When you go to those ceremonies, you see the reactions and the commitment of not only the officer, the family, and how deeply they're struck by that moment. The profession is in good hands. The Army profession, and then assuming the entire military profession with the other commissioning sources. Yeah.
And the ability of the cadets in the classroom to make those connections on why this is important. I have so many cadets that have a brother or sister who are serving, and they're like, I always think about the officer that's in charge of them. I want to be good. I want to be great, because I have to remember that someone like me is going to be giving them orders. So I got to be the best I can.
It is impressive, the caliber of future officers that we get to see, and we get to rub shoulders with, we can communicate and teach, right? And to see them give their oath, give their word to go out and serve. I'll close it there. I appreciate the time, but you think about this, right? Having been appointed an officer in the Army of the United States, do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I take this obligation freely, without any mental reservations or purpose of evasion, and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office upon which I am about to enter. So help me God. It means much, and it's important. Thanks for your time today, gentlemen. Thank you for what you do, preparing future officers, and this has been good. Thank you.
Thanks, sir.
This has been a production of the WPAOG Broadcast Network. Please take a moment to rate and review the show and join us each week for a new episode. Thank you for listening.